The Grandfather and the Grandson. Part 1. Whoever at that day had passed through the little city of Vernon and walked over that beautiful monumental bridge, which will be very soon replaced, let us hope, by some horrid wire bridge, would have noticed, as his glance fell from the top of the parapet, a man of about 50, with a leather casque on his head, dressed in pantaloons and waistcoat of coarse grey cloth, to which something yellow was stitched which had been a red ribbon, shod in wooden shoes, browned by the sun, his face almost black and his hair almost white, a large scar upon his forehead extending down his cheek, bent, bowed down, older than his years, walking nearly every day with a spade and pruning knife in his hand, in one of those walled compartments in the vicinity of the bridge which, like a chain of terraces, border the left bank of the Seine. All these enclosures are bounded by the river on one side and by a house on the other. The man in the waistcoat and wooden shoes of whom we have just spoken lived, about the year 1817, in the smallest of these enclosures, and the humblest of these houses. He lived there solitary and alone, in silence and in poverty, with a woman who was neither young nor old, neither beautiful nor ugly, neither peasant nor bourgeois, who waited upon him. The square of earth which he called his garden was celebrated in the town for the beauty of the flowers which he cultivated in it. Flowers were his occupation. Whoever at the same time had read the military memoirs, the biographies, the Moniteur, and the bulletins of the Grand Army would have been struck by a name which appears rather often, the name of George Pontmercy. When quite young, this George Pontmercy was a soldier in the regiment of Saint-Agne. At Waterloo he led a squadron of cuirassiers in Dubois' brigade. It was he who took colours from the Lunenburg battalion. He carried the colours to the Emperor's feet. He was covered with blood. He had received, in seizing the colours, a sabre stroke across his face. The Emperor, well pleased, cried to him, "You are a colonel, you are a baron, you are an officer of the Legion of Honour." Pontmercy answered, "Sire, thank you for my widow." An hour afterward he fell in the ravine of Ohain. Now who was this George Pontmercy? He was that very brigand of the Loire. The Restoration put him on half pay, then sent him to a residence, that is to say, under surveillance, at Vernon. The king, Louis XVIII., ignoring all that had been done in the 100 Days, recognized neither his position of officer of the Legion of Honour, nor his rank of colonel, nor his title of baron. He, on his part, neglected no opportunity to sign himself Colonel Baron Pontmercy. He had only one old blue coat, and he never went out without putting on the rosette of an officer of the Legion of Honour. He had nothing but this very scanty half-pay as chief of squadron. He hired the smallest house he could find in Vernon. He lived there alone. How, we have just seen. Under the Empire, between two wars, he had found time to marry Mademoiselle Gillenormand. The old bourgeois, who really felt outraged, consented with a sigh, saying, "The greatest families are forced to it." In 1815, Madame Pontmercy, an admirable woman in every respect, noble and rare, and worthy of her husband, died, leaving a child. This child would have been the colonel's joy in his solitude, but the grandfather had imperiously demanded his grandson, declaring that unless he were given up to him, he would disinherit him. The father yielded for the sake of the little boy, and not being able to have his child, he set about loving flowers. Monsieur Gillenormand had no intercourse with his son-in-law. The colonel was to him a bandit, and he was to the colonel a blockhead. Monsieur Gillenormand never spoke of the colonel, unless sometimes to make mocking allusions to his barony. It was expressly understood that Pontmercy should never endeavour to see his son or to speak to him, under pain of the boy being turned away and disinherited. To the Gillenormand, Pontmercy was pestiferous. They intended to bring up the child to their liking. The colonel did wrong, perhaps, to accept these conditions, but he submitted to them, thinking that he was doing right, and sacrificing himself alone. The inheritance from the grandfather Gillenormand was a small affair, but the inheritance from Mademoiselle Gillenormand, the elder, was considerable. This aunt, who had remained single, was very rich from the maternal side, and the son of her sister was her natural heir. The child, whose name was Marius, knew he had a father, but nothing more. Nobody spoke a word to him about him. However, in the society into which his grandfather took him, the whisperings, the hints, the winks, enlightened the little boy's mind at length. He finally comprehended some of it, and, as he naturally imbibed by a sort of infiltration and slow penetration the ideas and opinions which formed, so to say, the air he breathed, he came little by little to think of his father only with shame and with a closed heart. While he was thus growing up, every 2 or 3 months the colonel would escape, come furtively to Paris like a fugitive from justice breaking his ban, and go to Saint-Sulpice at the hour when Aunt Gillenormand took Marius to Mass. There, trembling lest the aunt should turn around, concealed behind a pillar, motionless, not daring to breathe, he saw his child. The scarred veteran was afraid of the old maid. Twice a year, on the 1st of January and on St. George's Day, Marius wrote filial letters to his father, which his aunt dictated, and which, one would have said, were copied from some complete letter writer. This was all that Monsieur Gillenormand allowed, and the father answered with very tender letters, which the grandfather thrust into his pocket without reading. Part 2. Marius Pontmercy went, like all children, through various studies. When he left the hands of Aunt Gillenormand, his grandfather entrusted him to a worthy professor of the purest classic innocence. This young, unfolding soul passed from a prude to a pedant. Marius had his years at college, then he entered the law school. He was royalist, fanatical, and austere. He had little love for his grandfather, whose gaiety and cynicism wounded him, and the place of his father was a dark void. For the rest, he was an ardent but cool lad, noble, generous, proud, religious, lofty, honourable even to harshness, pure even to unsociableness. In 1827, Marius had just attained his 18th year. On coming in one evening, he saw his grandfather with a letter in his hand.
"Marius,"
said Monsieur Gillenormand,
"you will set out tomorrow for Vernon."
"What for?" said Marius.
"To see your father."
Marius shuddered. He had thought of everything but this, that a day might come when he would have to see his father. Nothing could have been more unlooked for, more surprising, and more, we must say, disagreeable. It was an aversion compelled to intimacy. It was not chagrin, no, it was pure drudgery. Marius, besides his feelings of political antipathy, was convinced that his father, the sabre, as Monsieur Gillenormand called him in gentler moments, did not love him. That was clear, since he had abandoned him, and left him to others. Feeling that he was not loved at all, he had no love. Nothing more natural, said he to himself. He was so astounded that he did not question Monsieur Gillenormand. The grandfather continued.
"It appears he is sick. He asks for you."
The next day at dusk, Marius arrived at Vernon. Candles were just beginning to be lighted. He asked for the first person he met, for the house of Monsieur Pontmercy, for in his feelings he agreed with the Restoration, and he too recognized his father neither as baron nor as colonel. The house was pointed out to him. He rang. A woman came and opened the door with a small lamp in her hand. "Monsieur Pontmercy?" said Marius. The woman remained motionless. "Is he here?" said Marius. The woman gave an affirmative nod of the head. "Can I speak with him?" The woman gave a negative sign. "But I am his son," resumed Marius. "He expects me." "He expects you no longer," said the woman. Then he perceived that she was in tears. She pointed to the door of a low room. He entered. In this room, which was lighted by a tallow candle on the mantel, there were 3 men, one of them standing, one on his knees, and one stripped to his shirt and lying at full length upon the floor. The one upon the floor was the colonel. The 2 others were a physician and a priest who was praying. The colonel had been 3 days before attacked with a brain fever. At the beginning of the sickness, having presentiment of ill, he had written to Monsieur Gillenormand to ask for his son. He had grown worse. On the very evening of Marius's arrival at Vernon, the colonel had a fit of delirium. He sprang out of his bed in spite of the servant, crying, "My son has not come. I'm going to meet him." Then he had gone out of his room and fallen upon the floor of the hall. He had but just died. The doctor and the curé had been sent for. The doctor had come too late. The curé had come too late. The son also had come too late. By the dim light of the candle, they could distinguish upon the cheek of the pale and supine colonel a big tear which had fallen from his death-stricken eye. The eye was glazed, but the tear was not dry. This tear was for his son's delay. Marius looked upon this man, whom he saw for the first time and for the last. This venerable and manly face, these open eyes which saw not, this white hair, these robust limbs, upon which he distinguished here and there brown lines which were sabre cuts, and a species of red stars which were bullet holes. He looked upon that gigantic scar, which imprinted heroism upon this face on which God had impressed goodness. He thought that this man was his father, and that this man was dead, and he remained unmoved. The sorrow which he experienced was the sorrow which he would have felt before any other man whom he might have seen stretched out in death. Mourning, bitter mourning, was in that room. The servant was lamenting by herself in a corner. The curé was praying, and his sobs were heard. The doctor was wiping his eyes. The corpse itself wept. This doctor, this priest, and this woman looked at Marius through their affliction without saying a word. It was he who was the stranger. Marius, too little moved, felt ashamed and embarrassed at his attitude. He had his hat in his hand. He let it fall to the floor to make them believe that grief deprived him of strength to hold it. At the same time, he felt something like remorse, and he despised himself for acting thus. But was it his fault? He did not love his father, indeed. The colonel left nothing. The sale of his furniture hardly paid for his burial. The servant found a scrap of paper which he handed to Marius. It contained this, in the handwriting of the colonel: "For my son, the Emperor made me a baron upon the battlefield of Waterloo. Since the Restoration contests this title, which I have bought with my blood, my son will take it and bear it. I need not say he will be worthy of it." On the back, the colonel had added: "At this same battle of Waterloo, a sergeant saved my life. This man's name is Thénardier. Not long ago, I believe he was keeping a little tavern in a village in the suburbs of Paris, at Chelles or Montfermeil. If my son meets him, he will do Thénardier all the service he can." Not from duty toward his father, but on account of that vague respect for death, which is always so imperious in the heart of man, Marius took this paper and pressed it. No trace remained of the colonel. Monsieur Gillenormand had his sword and uniform sold to a second-hand dealer. The neighbors stripped the garden and carried off the rare flowers. The other plants became briary and scraggy and died. Marius remained only 48 hours at Vernon. After the burial, he returned to Paris and went back to his law, thinking no more of his father than if he had never lived. In 2 days the colonel had been buried, and in 3 days forgotten. Marius wore crape on his hat. That was all.